Hi, Matt from Martial Arts Business Dojo here, and today I have with me Joe Saunders. He's come all the way from Australia. So, how you doing, Joe?
I'm doing very well. It was a painless flight from the lounge room to my home office. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, my friend. You're somebody that I was really interested in talking to. Obviously, we've spoken before, but it's great to have the tables flipped and be able to chat with you. So, for the guys that maybe aren't sure of exactly what it is you do, can you give us a brief overview?
Sure. So I'll try and nutshell it down a little bit. I'm the host of the Managing Violence podcast, which you've been on. Matt was a guest back in season 2, potentially. So essentially, the Managing Violence podcast is my attempt to leech information off the biggest and brightest minds in not only martial arts but also self-defense and violence management broadly. But my background prior to that, I grew up as a martial artist. I spent a lot of time in traditional martial arts as a child and adolescent. Got into sporting martial arts, in particular judo. Judo was my first passion. It was the first one that I really excelled at. I got to an international level with judo. That led me to an international level competition in sumo wrestling, as well as Brazil. I didn't get international in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I competed in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and submission grappling as well. Had the opportunity to represent Australia in belt wrestling, which is a Eastern European style of wrestling as well. So I got to travel the world a little bit doing martial arts. But concurrent to that, when I was 18 years old, I started bouncing in nightclubs. And I wasn't a kid who grew up having a lot of fights. So I was kind of blessed that I had a fairly stable family life, and I got bullied a little bit, but I wasn't really I wasn't much of a punch-up kind of kid. But getting into bouncing when I was 18 or 19 years old, that changed for me. And despite all the martial arts and sporting abilities I had, I noticed there was still a big gap in terms of my skill set and what I was training for and what I was actually dealing with at work. And that led to me discovering reality-based self-defense, as it was the common term at the time. I ended up studying under Richard Dimitri, became an instructor under Richard Dimitri in the Senshido system. So I guess my background is all three of those things. I have a deep love for traditional martial arts. I see so much value in sporting martial arts, but I also have a strong grounding in the reality-based systems. And professionally, I'm an occupational violence prevention specialist. So my job is in helping organizations deal with cultural and systematic violence, I guess. So that's a nutshell. And I've also got 4 young kids who you may hear in the background because it's
Okay. So 4 young kids. That's conflict management skills right there. Stopping them guys.
I know, I've given up trying to win those fights. We're done.
So what I'm going to hopefully do is to come back on some of that through the conversation. But what I want to do is kind of start at the beginning, which is the simple question I tend to ask everybody, which is what actually got you into martial arts in the first place? What started you on that journey?
Yeah, so I grew up with 2 much older brothers. So my 2 brothers are 13 years and 15 years older than me. They're both so my parents were both on their second marriage, and I was the only child from the second marriage. So I had half siblings from both of their previous marriages. So I was definitely the baby of the family. Not definitely an accident, but I have my suspicions, maybe an accident. But anyway, so I had much older siblings, and when I was growing up, both my older brothers were national champions in Taekwondo. And from as early as I can remember, they would always go to tournaments, and that when they'd bring home the medal, they'd give it to me, the baby brother, and I'd get to wear the medal. And yeah, I thought that was the coolest thing in the world. They got medals and trophies, and and they were, I mean, they were kids at the 70s and 80s, so they growing up on Bruce Lee movies. So my house was always full of Bruce Lee movies and Jean-Claude Van Damme and Chuck Norris, and the quintessential 80s martial arts movies were always on TV. So from as early as I can remember, I wanted to be like them. And I eventually talked Mum into letting me start Taekwondo at 4 years of age. And they made an exception because I was a big kid. I wasn't supposed to start till I was 5, but whatever. So that basically started it. I went along just to tag along with my big brothers, and as it would evolve. We moved around a lot for my parents' work, and everywhere we went, I basically just found whatever art was convenient and cheap, and that led to me sampling a bunch of different arts, and it paid off eventually, even though I didn't really know what I was doing at the time.
Yeah, because obviously, myself being from the UK, I've no idea what the martial arts landscape would have looked like as a young man for you in Australia. I would imagine that finding high level tuition in a range of different arts would have been quite difficult.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I was a child, so I wasn't very discerning. It was realistically, mum and dad probably did the call around and found out who was charging what and told me these were my options. That was probably as deep as it went. But yeah, no, certainly. I mean, we're talking early '90s, and Taekwondo was big. There's a little bit of ninjutsu. Shotokan was around. I'm sure judo was around, although I didn't find it till I was a teenager. Yeah, but the styles I trained in were mostly Taekwondo, Goju-Ryu, a little bit of Kyokushinkai, and then boxing, kickboxing.
Right, yeah, and then as you say, you followed the pathway there and ended up with sumo. You mentioned, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
That's a strange thing to find yourself doing.
That was a random turn of events. Yeah. So I discovered. So I transitioned probably into grappling when I was about 15 years old, and I'd always loved pro wrestling growing up. Like, I loved pro wrestling, and I had stopped training martial arts for a couple of years and was playing rugby league fairly seriously, and I sustained excuse me, I sustained a fairly significant injury playing rugby league, and I wasn't allowed to play again for a little while. And I was just hitting the gym and trying to, I don't know, stay in shape, do something. And as I was walking out of the gym at this PCYC, which is like a YMCA or boys club, or the equivalent. As I was walking out of the gym area, I saw these guys over in the corner suplexing each other on mats. And I thought, that looks awesome. What are they doing? And I knew what Olympic wrestling was, but I'd never seen it before. And I went over there and introduced myself, and turns out they were an Olympic wrestling club. And so I got into that. I got really deep into Olympic wrestling. I loved it. It was the hardest training I'd ever done in my life. And it still is. I mean, it still is. Like, if you want to meet someone who's hard as nails, just talk to anyone who's done wrestling for more than 6 months. It was just mind numbing. And my coach was a guy named Yuri Markov, who had been a coach for the USSR national team. So he knew how to run a practice. But anyway, so I did wrestling for a little while, and but the big thing that was a limitation for me at the time, being 15, 16, 17, was there was no competition in Australia. There was like, what you could do nationals, and that was it. Like, there was no real intermediate level competitions. There just wasn't much going on. There were hardly any wrestlers. So I happened to try judo while my coach was in Russia for Christmas, and in judo you could compete like every 3 weeks. Like, there was a competition on all the time, and there's also people my own age. There weren't a whole lot of teenagers involved in wrestling at the time, and it provided a social outlet for me. So this is around about the time I was finishing high school, entering into university, and to be able to have people my own age to hang out with, and be able to go on the road and travel and do the competition tours and that sort of stuff was great fun. So so I ended up in judo, and then so to come full circle back to your question about sumo, it was actually a couple of years later. I got to an international level with judo, and a friend of mine who I met in that first wrestling club contacted me out of the blue. Hadn't spoken to him for a couple of years, and he said, "Hey, are you still training?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "What do you weigh?" And I said, "About 120 kilos. Why?" And he said, "I just got back from the World Sumo Championships in Estonia, and there's a sumo organization starting in Australia, and we need new wrestlers. And the middleweight division's 115 kilos. Do you think you can make 115? Because you might be able to get some international trips if you're as good as I remember." And I said, I'll give it a shot. And one thing led to another, and I fell in love with the culture of sumo as well. I think coming from a Japanese martial arts background, there's a lot I loved about sumo. But we can talk about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Again, it's one of those where it does have a romanticism attached to it. I think that then maybe that's something we're giving it that it shouldn't necessarily have. I'm not sure, but that is there. So one of the things that I find about sumo is that a lot of people underrate the skill sets involved.
Oh,
So,
absolutely.
yeah, so could you just clarify a little bit of the training on that? Because I know there's far more to it than meets the eye.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, it's the ultimate anaerobic sport. I mean, the average bout is about 12 seconds in length. So, I mean, if you go more than 30 seconds, it's a long bout. If you go more than a minute, like you need to take a breather and get the defibs out because someone's probably going to die. But certainly, if you watch, so I competed in what's called international sumo or amateur sumo, which has weight divisions and has female divisions as well. And you're allowed to wear bike pants or for the ladies, a wrestling singlet or whatever underneath the mawashi. So it's more international friendly. But if you watch the lighter weights, you'll see it's completely different to what you see when you have 160, 170 kilogram men trying to push each other out of a circle. It's a very, very small circle. So pushing someone out is a high percentage way of winning. If you take a couple of backward steps, you're pretty much on the edge. So that's what people typically see. And they see huge men crashing into each other and trying to push each other out of a circle. And it doesn't look like it involves that much skill. But there's a lot of judo transfers. In fact, there's a lot of throws that are in sumo that came from the original jiu-jitsu styles that led to the formation of judo as well. So there's a crossed history there. But certainly, I used a lot of judo in my and wrestling, I guess, but predominantly judo in my sumo. And there's a lot of guys that do come into it from Olympic wrestling backgrounds or judo backgrounds, and there's certainly a lot of deception and play and gamesmanship. It's got a very Japanese rule set where there's like 9 things that are illegal, then a whole bunch of things that are impolite. So there's a nuance to how the game is played, but it's extremely easy to understand. You touch the ground, you lose. You step out, you lose. Pretty much that. And after that, it kind of sorts itself out. So it's very spectator friendly, which I like.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So what's what another side of what you do outside of the martial arts is that you actually study psychology and behavioral science, and so you come at the question of self-defense and self-protection and stuff not just from a physical plane but from an academic and a mental approach as well. So what started you on that particular journey? Because I'm suspecting it's similar to my own.
It kind of snuck up on me. I always had the intention of becoming a teacher. That was my intended career path, and then I sort of had that crisis after 1 year of university where I realized I'd spent my entire life in a classroom and I couldn't really face the idea of going straight back into another classroom and staying there for the rest of my life. So I changed degrees, and I was very into my sport at the time, and I had this idea that maybe I could get into sports psychology or performance psychology or something like that. And I took on psych for that purpose, to get into training athletes or working with athletes on the mental game. And I started to really be fascinated by these compulsory subjects that I had to do, which I had no interest in, such as social psychology, developmental psychology, forensic psychology. And as I got into that, I was like, this is interesting, because now I'm working in clubs as well. And I'm learning just as much about practical psychology on the door as I am in the lecture theater, probably more so. And I'm starting to make sense of this craziness that I'm seeing 3, 4, 5 nights a week on an academic level. And that kind of intrigued me a little bit more. And I still didn't really know what I was going to do with it at the end of that. And it was only sort of as my career in the security industry developed, and that was an accident. I never expected to be part of a security industry. I expected to just, throw some people out in nightclubs, get paid, and move on with my life. And yet here I am. But it's it was just one of those things. As my career evolved, I got into reality-based self-defense, and obviously there's a lot of psychology involved in the reality of violence. And it just sort of, as I started studying in my own time and looking at postgraduate options, but also just my own readings, I definitely went down the path of why are people violent to each other? How much of it is preventable? How much of it is nature versus nurture, all these sorts of big questions. And how do we make our society less violent while not being completely naive to human nature and human history?
Yeah. Well, I think from my own experience, which is why I said I think it might be similar to yours, because there was an awful lot of physical training, but then it was only when I started working in security and having to apply that physical training that I realized that there was a huge psychological element that was the make or break of most situations. And that was a huge revelation from my point of view. And it was something that I thought, I've got to know more about this. I've got to try and figure this out a little bit. And so from that point of view, I think, is there, if you had to point martial arts instructors towards something that would give them a really good overview of that side of things, is there something that you could suggest?
Yeah, take the blinkers off. I think, and I say that with all love and respect, because I love the martial arts, and I've got so many friends that are wonderful martial arts instructors. But too often we seek to mimic our instructors as opposed to actually seeking truth. And I think it doesn't mean you have to change your style. It doesn't mean you have to abandon a gi, put on camo, and start talking about OODA loops like that. You don't have to do that. But I mean, look, The Art of War was written 3,000 years ago. It mentions psychology of combat. The Book of Five Rings, Miyamoto Musashi, is every sword style still in existence apparently traces itself back to Musashi's one way or another. I know it's just because it's PR, but I mean, he talks extensively about psychology of combat and dominating getting the mental high ground and causing frustration and angst and all that sort of thing. It's all in there. Bruce Lee talks about it extensively in Tao of Jeet Kune Do and in his early writings, and in Longstreet. I mean, it's everywhere. It's always been there. This is not something that is. It didn't start with Jeff Thompson. It didn't start with Tony Blauer. It didn't start with Richard Dimitri. It's been there since people started thinking deeper about, I can learn to punch really hard, but how can I stop hurting my knuckles by not getting into those fights in the first place? Yeah. And realistically, I mean, it's all there. It's in the writings. That probably in your art, there are probably writings about it, but we are so fixated on learning our forms or improving physical attributes that we tend to neglect the other side.
Yeah, totally. I mean, there was a blog post you wrote a little while ago, and I'm just going to read the start of it because this kind of highlights the point, and I'd like your opinion on how the rest of that blog went. So you wrote, as a long-term traditional martial artist, as well as a fierce proponent of reality-based self-defense, I am often asked how I can seemingly play for both teams. And so that's a really interesting question, because for some reason people seem to think they have to be in one camp or the other. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I did too. When I first discovered reality-based self-defense, I started drinking the Kool-Aid on that, and didn't want to train in a gi ever again. Like, well, that's useless. And then you start ripping some t-shirts and you realize that robust training uniforms have a place. It's like, I'm never going to train in bare feet. I've never been in a fight barefoot. It's like, my mats are getting torn up. Maybe we'll just take the shoes off. Like, you start realizing that some of these traditions are actually there for a purpose, and that much smarter people than you figured this out years ago. It's got nothing to do with reality. It's practicality. But anyway, that's a sidetrack. But yeah, I've gone down both paths, and same thing when I got really into sporting martial arts and MMA, and I was going to be an MMA fighter, and started sort of. I won't say I was denigrating the other arts, but I was definitely going, oh, you guys you're not as far along the evolutionary path as some of us, like it's a little bit of snideness, as only someone in their early 20s can. And probably sipping on my almond latte at the same time. But acai bowls weren't out just yet. But what I realized is that I loved different things about different systems and different styles of training. And I realized that they all benefited me and they all added to my life in one way or another. So for example, I love traditional martial arts for the sake of the art. I love studying something that I can get progressively better at, that hopefully doesn't leave me damaged and injured and unable to go to work, that I can never be perfect at, that there's always more to learn, that has things that appeal to me. I've always had sort of like a warrior inclination, and I like hierarchy, and I like structure, and I like form, and I like that. Yeah, that feels good to me spiritually. And if I'm studying something that has, as far as I can tell, zero combat applicability, or at least very minimal combat applicability, but it's still fulfilling something in me, that's cool. I'm not getting into fights every day of my life. I've moved on with my life. It's been a few years since I've been in a fight now, and hopefully I get to keep it that way. So it doesn't really matter. So if it's benefiting my life in that way, great. Sporting martial arts, the same deal. I love competition. I absolutely love competition. I'll compete over just about anything. And it has a place. And I don't mind if that sporting competition doesn't make me feel more like a warrior, and it just makes me feel like an athlete and gets me super fit and improves my physical attributes. That's cool too. And reality-based self-defense is probably actually, it's funny because this is my career, it's probably actually my least favorite to train in, because I feel like after a while you've kind of, the cup is full enough, and it's now about attribute development. So I like to top up with doing scenario replication and do some role play and do that kind of stuff, just to make sure that I'm still sharp. But then I go back to the traditional arts and the combat sports to build the physical skills and to maintain those physical skills. And the reality base is just kind of a way to make sure I'm still staying current with what threats look like, and keeping that reaction time in line. But I think the majority of what does that for me now is just sparring. And we in sporting style rules, occasionally you can mix it up and throw a training knife in there, or try and box two people at once just to make things interesting. But it's all fun, and look, our forefathers in martial arts, I mean, the fact that your martial arts is still available now means it probably worked at some stage or another, right? If it doesn't work, it's because you've forgotten how to teach it, or someone before you forgot how to teach it and started marketing crap because it's more commercially viable. But it all works.
Yeah.
It's up to us to teach it properly, and they're all doing this. I mean, I struggle to believe that warriors that were training for warfare 300 years ago, 400 years ago, weren't doing some sort of reality-based drilling. Whether they would be doing something that mimics warfare because they weren't idiots.
Yes.
They would be doing something that looks like sparring because they would have realized that makes them better at fighting. We've just sort of shrunk it down into a nice little commercially acceptable package now that looks good on the stock photos.
Oh, absolutely. And it's one of those where the truth is, as you already mentioned there, is that not everybody wants the same thing from their training and from their learning. And so there's something for everybody. And that's one of the great things about it. As long as people are clear about what they're offering and what it is that they can get from it, then that's great. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I know guys that do a lot of reality stuff, but they don't do any sort of combat sport side of things, and they don't do any traditional side of things. And there's deficits in their knowledge, and the same when you apply that in other ways. And so having that rounded experience level and learning from all those different elements is definitely the way forward as far as I'm concerned. So that then takes us to the podcast that you've started doing, which is Managing Violence, and that's been going for a while now. And you have some extraordinarily interesting guests on there, and some of those guys are absolutely just fonts of information. Now, firstly, that must be amazing for you to be able to sit and chat with these guys. But secondly, have you got like a set sort of question that you want to get from these guys? Is there something? Have you got like a plan before you sit down and chat with them?
Yeah, so firstly, it's an amazing honor. I'm still blown away with the people I've been able to talk to. Look, I was an instructor here. Some people knew me locally. Some people may have followed my blog years ago internationally, but that was it. Like, I wasn't known in any way, and nor should I be really. I hadn't done anything that spectacular, I didn't think. Yeah, I started the podcast because I wanted to listen to a podcast about that with those people, and there wasn't one. And I thought, well, there's got to be more people like me that want to listen to a show like that. Maybe I'll start one. And I didn't think I would get the names that I've got. I thought I'd just reach out to people that I knew. So I had access to a bunch of good instructors through Senshido and a few other mutual connections, people I'd met on seminars and so on. That I thought, yeah, I've probably got a bunch of interesting guests, probably not super well known, but some interesting people. Mm. And that was kind of all I started with. And I had this bucket list of guests that I thought one day, once this thing is really established, I might be able to get someone like Rory Miller on the show. Yeah, Rory Miller would be like one of the top list guests. And Rory was on my second ever interview show. Like I happened to be friends with him on Facebook, just one of those things. I'd send him a friend request sort of cheekily and he'd accept it. And we never conversed. And I just sent him a message saying, hey, I'm starting a podcast. If you're ever interested in being on it, yeah, it'd be a great honor. And he came back and said, sure, when do you want to record? And I'm like, whoa, I've got Rory Miller straight away. And that kind of just one thing led to another. Sometimes guests have referred me to other guests within their networks, and that sort of, especially early on when it was getting started, that was huge because it just vouched for my credibility as someone who was worth talking to. And then obviously, I mean, my interviewing people is a skill. I had no idea that there was actually a skill set involved in being able to stage a coherent interview, and that took me a little while. I haven't listened back to season 1 for a while, but it's going to be painful when I do.
Yes, I'm finding this out for myself now as we go, and I feel your pain on that. So
yeah, man, it's rough, man, and it depends on your guest too. I've had some guests I've had to really work on to like either keep them on track or to pull back and to or pull something out of them. Some people more forthcoming than others. Others, you're like, man, it's been 2 hours and this is supposed to be a 45-minute show. So and to your second question was about structure. I sort of decided early on not to structure too much because I never wanted to be the same show over and over. And a lot of the time, if you're talking to martial artists, and that was another thing, I never intended to be a martial arts show. It was always about violence as a whole. I wanted to get different perspectives on violence, whether they be combatives practitioners or whether they be martial artists or whether they be an ER doctor or whether they be a psychologist or a psychiatrist or whoever. Yeah. I wanted to get all different views. And that was kind of my intention. But because of that, I never wanted to have a set format other than I just wanted to know their story. And then draw from their story what their lessons learned were. Because what I found is that most of the people that had achieved a high level within the industry had some sort of personal connection with violence and they had learned their own lessons along the way. If they're more academically minded or they have more academic background, then we just draw out upon their research and what they found interesting and it's really just an organic conversation. Set questions I save for our Patreon subscribers. So I have a series of 7 set questions that I ask at the end of each episode, which are more sort of human interest stuff about, there's some interesting stuff in there too, but yeah, that's more just a bonus for subscribers.
Right. Yeah, cool. So obviously you're pretty established now in that world. And one of the things is in the modern age with everybody getting more and more up to date with IT and how to work things and stuff, people starting podcasts now is becoming more and more sort of commonplace. So if you could offer any advice out to people who are looking to start that journey, could you offer a few to-dos and maybe 1 or 2 to-don'ts?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing is probably a don't, but you don't need to spend a lot of money to get started. I've seen some people that have really dumped a ton of cash in getting top quality gear and getting soundproofing their rooms and doing all this cool stuff, which I've now done. But then they've done 1 or 2 shows and got bored of it. It's a lot of work. Like it's a lot of work generating a podcast. So that each episode takes me 4 to 5 hours realistically to get it out, and that's time that is not my job. That's time that I'm putting in. That's not time with my family. It's not time that I'm doing recreational activities. I love what I'm doing, but it's still work sometimes. So don't spend a ton of money until you know you're going to go with it, until you know you've got an idea that's worth listening to as well. I mean, if your idea is like, I want to do the Tim Ferriss show, well, why wouldn't you just listen to the Tim Ferriss show? Like, make sure you're contributing something. Whether it could just be your unique personality, your unique take, your unique friends, whatever it is, but make sure it's something that's different, because otherwise you're never going to get the listeners, and that's you're not going to get the payoff. No one's going to listen to you do a Tim Ferriss impression or a Joe Rogan impression because that's what you like listening to. You need to be authentic. So yeah, don't spend a ton of money until you know you're going to continue with it. And there's plenty of ways of doing it for free. Like I started out pretty much for free. I used Anchor to host my Anchor.fm to host my podcast. That's free. I still use them. They're brilliant. I used, I think I got a $150 Blue Yeti microphone. I think my first one, the first episode or two I recorded on a lapel mic that I had for video stuff from a few years ago. The sound quality was terrible, but you can make it work. But once you have established that, that's probably the first thing I'd say you need to invest in is improving your sound quality, because nothing will turn people off faster than sounding amateur. So yeah, you don't have to spend a ton of money, but make sure that you're not sounding like you're recording inside a tin can or you're using your inbuilt MacBook microphone. Just a little bit of money there will go a long way. And lastly, I think it's make sure you've got a goal. Like having a conversation that goes nowhere isn't very compelling for me to listen next time. If you're trying to draw out information, great. For my show, my goal with the Managing Violence podcast since day one has been to educate people about violence so that we can eliminate pointless violence as much as possible. That's my driving force. Sometimes that's the form of Lee Morrison telling you how to hit someone really hard. Sometimes that's the form of a Dave Grossman talking about the dangers of sleep deprivation and exposing children to graphic violence. Sometimes that's a mental health nurse talking about psychiatric disorders. Whatever the case is, my goal from day one has been to make a safer society for my kids and other generations. That's my driving purpose. Yeah. It's not just having a conversation with cool people.
No, that's actually a really good, some good solid bits of advice there with regards to, because people make similar mistakes all the time, don't they? So that's really great for you to share that. Now, if people want to reach out to you, how can they do that?
Yeah, sure. So most social media on there is Managing Violence. So we're on Facebook and LinkedIn, probably the most active. You can also see my website at www.joesaunders.com.au. You can email me at joe@joesaunders.com.au. Any corporate inquiries, go to LinkedIn. I'm very active over there from a consulting angle. Anything else, feel free to jump on the Managing Violence Tribe Facebook group rather. Like the Facebook page, add me as a friend. I'm not very security minded. I'll accept you, provided you have other people as your friends.
All right, cool. All right, well, Joe, it's been a genuine pleasure chatting with you today, my friend, and thank you so much for giving us the time and coming on.
No worries, man, and thank you for all the work you do. You're doing great things for the martial arts community and the broader community with in challenging times to move forward and adapt and modernize, and it's great fun to watch.
Thank you so much.